American generals did not simply hate British soldiers. That version is too easy. What many of them resented was something deeper: the British way of fighting the war. Britain and America were fighting the same enemy. But inside the alliance, they were also fighting another battle over speed, caution, command, prestige, and the shape of victory itself. On the posters, they stood shoulder to shoulder. In the command rooms, the arguments were sharper, and by 1944, one British commander had become the lightning rod for almost everything some American generals found infuriating about Britain's war. Not British courage, not the ordinary British soldier, but British strategy, British caution, British pride, and the uncomfortable question of who would decide how victory in Europe should be won. The clean version of the Second World War is simple. Britain held on, America arrived, the Allies worked together. Germany was defeated. There is truth in that, but it is not the whole truth. The alliance that fought its way across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany was not a machine made of polished steel. It was a living thing. It had nerves, it had bruises, it had egos, it had national memories that did not match. To the public, the message had to be unity. British and American soldiers shared ports, airfields, supply depots, roads, hospitals, and graveyards. They fought in the same campaign and depended on one another in ways no propaganda poster could fully explain. But at the top, the argument was different. The Americans entered the European war with vast industrial strength, growing manpower, and a strategic instinct for directness. Many American commanders wanted to get across the Channel, land in France, drive hard into Germany, and finish the war by destroying the German army as quickly as possible. The British were not against victory. They had been fighting Germany since 1939. They had stood through the fall of France, Dunkirk, the Blitz, the Atlantic War, the Desert Campaign, and the long years before American ground power arrived in Europe. But those years had shaped them. British commanders were carrying a different memory. The First World War had left a deep scar on British military thinking. So had Dunkirk. So had the hard arithmetic of being a smaller island nation already stretched across the globe. To some Americans, British caution looked like delay. To many British planners, caution looked like survival. That difference did not begin in Normandy. It began earlier, when the Allies had to decide how Germany would be attacked at all. The American preference was often for a direct cross-channel invasion, as soon as it could be made to work. France was the shortest road to Germany. Put enough power there, break out, and drive east. The British looked at that same road and saw danger. They remembered what happened when armies were thrown into continental battles without enough preparation. They also knew that Britain could not replace losses forever. A failed invasion would not be a bad headline. It could cripple the coalition. So Britain pushed for a more cautious, peripheral war first. North Africa, the Mediterranean, Sicily, Italy. To British eyes, this was not cowardice. It was a way to fight while building strength, wearing Germany down, and avoiding a premature disaster in France. To some American eyes, it looked like a detour. That was one of the earliest cracks. It was not that American generals looked at British soldiers and despised them. American soldiers had seen British troops fight hard in North Africa, Italy, and later Normandy. They knew courage when they saw it. The irritation was higher up. It was about decisions: where to attack, when to attack, how much risk to accept, who would command, and who would receive credit when the war was finally won. Coalition warfare sounds noble after the fact. In the moment, it is often a room full of men who agree on the enemy and disagree on almost everything else. By 1944, the Allies had done what once seemed impossible. They had prepared the invasion of Northwest Europe. Operation Overlord was not just a landing. It was a floating city of ships, landing craft, aircraft, armor, engineers, supply units, and men from Britain, America, Canada, and other Allied nations. It required planning on a scale that still feels almost unreal. Dwight Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander. That title sounds powerful. In reality, it meant he had to do more than defeat Germany. He had to hold together an alliance of governments, armies, and personalities that could easily pull in different directions. Eisenhower's gift was not that he shouted the loudest. It was that he understood the politics of command. He knew that victory in Europe would not be won by one army, one nation, or one general.
It would have to be managed.
And then there was Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was not a minor figure. He had helped restore British confidence in the desert. He had become a public symbol of competence after years when Britain badly needed one. For many British civilians and soldiers, Monty was proof that Britain could still produce commanders who won. But Montgomery was also difficult. Even sympathetic accounts rarely make him sound easy. He could be self-assured to the point of arrogance. He liked clear control. He believed in his own plans. He had little talent for making rivals feel valued. To some American commanders, Montgomery became the face of British obstruction. If the British wanted to slow things down, they saw Montgomery. If the British wanted more resources, they saw Montgomery. If the British press praised British command, they saw Montgomery. If an operation did not move as fast as promised, they saw Montgomery. That made him useful for a story, but it also made the story too simple. Because Montgomery was not just a personality problem. He represented a real strategic disagreement. For the British, the land campaign in Europe had to be controlled, prepared, supplied, and protected. They wanted to avoid a reckless dash that might overextend the armies and allow Germany to hit back. They were also conscious that Britain's manpower was not endless. By 1944, the British Army was facing serious strain in infantry replacements. Every major battle consumed men Britain could not easily replace. For the Americans, especially as their forces grew in size, the danger seemed different. They feared that caution would give Germany time. American commanders such as Omar Bradley and George Patton were associated with a more aggressive style in Northwest Europe. They wanted movement, exploitation, pressure. When German lines cracked, they wanted to drive through the gap before it closed. This did not mean Americans were careless. It meant they believed momentum was a weapon. And in Normandy, that argument became personal. The landings on June 6, 1944, succeeded, but the campaign did not unfold like a clean arrow on a map. The Allies secured the beaches, but inland Normandy became a brutal, cramped battlefield of hedgerows, villages, artillery, mines, mud, dust, and German defensive skill. The British and Canadians fought around Caen, on the eastern side of the bridgehead. The Americans fought through the bocage in the west. Each side faced different terrain and different problems. Caen became one of the great points of accusation. Before D-Day, Montgomery expected Caen to be taken quickly. It was not. German resistance was fierce, and the city became a magnet for heavy fighting. To critics, especially those already suspicious of Montgomery, the delay seemed to confirm everything they disliked about him. Too slow, too cautious, too careful with British forces, too willing to let others wait.
But the reality
Is more complicated. The fighting around Caen also drew in a large part of Germany's armored strength. British and Canadian forces paid heavily, but their pressure helped keep German armor fixed in the east, while American forces eventually broke through in the west. That does not make every British decision perfect. It does not erase the cost. It does not mean Montgomery's critics had no case. But it does show why the old insult is too crude. What looked like delay on one part of the map could also serve a purpose on another part of the map. This is where the war becomes harder than slogans. A battlefield is not one road. It is a system of roads, rivers, railways, ports, fuel dumps, bridges, weather, reserves, and exhausted men. The Americans were right that speed mattered. The British were right that control mattered. The problem was that both truths could not always be served at the same time. In late July 1944, the American breakout from Normandy finally came. Operation Cobra smashed open the German front in the west. Patton's Third Army entered the campaign and began moving with extraordinary speed. Now the American case looked powerful. The Germans were retreating. France was opening. The map seemed to invite boldness. To men like Patton, every pause could feel like a gift to the enemy. But the faster the Allies moved, the more the war changed shape. Every mile forward stretched the supply lines. Fuel had to come from beaches and ports behind them. Ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, and bridging equipment had to move over roads battered by war. Armies that looked unstoppable on a map could still be slowed by petrol cans, traffic jams, and broken railways. That is not glamorous. But wars are often decided by unglamorous things. By the autumn of 1944, the argument sharpened into one of the most important disputes of the Western campaign: broad front or narrow thrust. Eisenhower favored advancing on a broad front. The idea was to keep pressure across the line, use all Allied armies, avoid giving Germany a single obvious target, and prevent one spearhead from racing so far ahead that it became vulnerable. Montgomery argued for concentrating power in the north. He wanted a strong thrust towards the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, with priority given to his army group. In his view, a focused blow could break the German position faster than a general advance everywhere. Bradley and Patton had their own ambitions and objections. They were not eager to see American divisions placed under Montgomery's direction or starved of supplies, so a British-led thrust could receive priority. This was not just a military argument, it was national. By 1944, American strength in Europe was becoming overwhelming. The United States was providing a growing share of the men and materiel. Many Americans believed the command structure and public credit should reflect that reality. Britain, meanwhile, had been in the war from the beginning. It had endured years of danger before American ground armies arrived in France. British leaders did not want the final campaign to be remembered as if Britain had merely held the door open and then stepped aside. So when Montgomery asked for priority, American irritation was not only about maps, it was about prestige. Who would lead the main blow into Germany? Who would be seen as the architect of victory? Would the final image of the war in the West be American speed or British command? Nobody in headquarters needed to say this too loudly. It was already in the room. The narrow thrust debate also had a practical problem. A spearhead needs supply. If the Allies concentrated everything in one direction, other armies would have to slow down. That meant choosing winners and losers inside the coalition. It meant telling some commanders to wait while another commander advanced. For Eisenhower, that was dangerous. He was not simply solving a staff college exercise. He was keeping the Americans, British, Canadians, and other allies inside one political military structure. A bold plan that broke the alliance's trust could become more costly than a cautious plan that frustrated everyone equally. This was Eisenhower's burden. He had to make decisions that soldiers would later judge by speed, politicians would judge by credit, and historians would judge with maps no commander possessed in real time. Then came Market Garden. In September 1944, Montgomery's northern strategy received a dramatic test. Operation Market Garden aimed to use airborne forces and a rapid ground advance to seize bridges through the Netherlands and open a route towards Germany. It was bold. That matters, because Montgomery is sometimes remembered only as cautious. Market Garden was not cautious. It was ambitious, risky, and dependent on timing, roads, bridges, intelligence, weather, and German reaction. The operation captured some objectives, but failed to secure the final bridge at Arnhem. It did not open the road into Germany as hoped. For Montgomery's critics, this failure was powerful ammunition. If he wanted priority, and if his bold operation failed, why should American commanders accept lectures from him about how to win the war? For British defenders of Montgomery, the story looked different. They could argue that the operation came close, that the strategic idea of a northern thrust still made sense, and that failure did not prove the broad front was perfect. But the trust problem deepened. The alliance continued to advance, but beneath the surface, there was suspicion. American commanders suspected British caution when the British asked for control. British commanders suspected American impatience when the Americans demanded speed. Each side could see the other's weakness more clearly than its own. And then, in December 1944, Germany struck back. The Ardennes offensive, known to many as the Battle of the Bulge, shocked the Allies. German forces attacked through difficult terrain in Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a dangerous salient in the Allied line. The crisis forced emergency decisions. Because the German attack disrupted communications and split the front, Eisenhower placed some American forces in the north under Montgomery's temporary command. Militarily, there was logic to it. Politically and emotionally, it was explosive. For American commanders already irritated by Montgomery, the idea of American troops under British command was hard enough. But the deeper wound came after the immediate crisis, when Montgomery's public handling of the battle created anger among Americans who felt he had taken too much credit for the Allied response. The issue was not that Montgomery said nothing positive about Americans. He did praise them. But perception matters in coalitions. Many Americans believed the tone suggested that British command had steadied a situation created by American difficulty. That impression was poisonous. American troops had fought brutally in the Ardennes. They had held, counterattacked, suffered, improvised, and endured winter conditions under severe pressure. Any suggestion that the battle had been rescued chiefly by Montgomery was bound to offend. This is one reason the phrase, "hated British soldiers," misses the target. The anger was not aimed at the men freezing in British uniforms. It was aimed at command, credit, and the feeling that Britain wanted to shape the story after shaping the strategy. At times, American frustration with Montgomery became frustration with Britain itself. That is how coalitions work when trust thins. One man becomes a flag. One press conference becomes a national insult. One operational delay becomes proof of a whole people's weakness. But that is not history. That is emotion looking for a uniform.
The British soldier in Normandy,
Italy, Burma, or the Atlantic was not the same thing as Montgomery's public manner. The British Army was not only Montgomery. Britain's war was not only headquarters politics, it was also the Royal Navy keeping sea lanes open. It was RAF crews flying over occupied Europe. It was code breakers working in secrecy. It was engineers, drivers, medics, factory workers, and civilians who had lived with war for years. It was Canadian, Indian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and other Commonwealth forces whose contribution cannot be folded lazily into a single word called British. And it was ordinary infantrymen paying for decisions made far above them. That is the part the title cannot hold by itself. American generals did not look at a British rifleman in a slit trench and see the enemy. They saw, in British strategy, a style of war they often found maddening. A style shaped by an older empire, a smaller manpower pool, a longer experience of the conflict, a fear of unnecessary bloodletting, and a political need to remain central in a coalition increasingly dominated by American power. The British saw the Americans differently. They could admire American energy and resources while worrying that American commanders underestimated the dangers of overextension. They could respect American fighting power while fearing that speed without preparation might repeat the disasters Britain had spent decades trying not to repeat. Both sides had a point. Both sides also had blind spots. American aggression helped drive the war forward. Without American manpower, industry, logistics, and operational pressure, the liberation of Western Europe would have been impossible on the scale it happened. British caution was not mere timidity. It came from experience, constraint, and a hard understanding that Britain could not spend lives as if the island had an endless reserve of infantry. The tragedy of coalition command is that the same quality can look different depending on where you stand. Speed can look like courage. Speed can also look like recklessness. Caution can look like wisdom. Caution can also look like delay. Confidence can look like leadership. Confidence can also look like arrogance. By 1945, the Allies still won. That fact can make the arguments seem smaller than they were. Victory has a way of smoothing the cracks. Newsreels preferred unity. Memoirs defended reputations. National memory selected its heroes and tidied away the uglier rooms. But the tension was real. It lived in strategy conferences. It lived in supply decisions. It lived in arguments over who would command whom. It lived in the narrow space between military necessity and national pride. And perhaps that is the real hidden truth. Not that American generals hated British soldiers. That is too blunt, too cheap, too easy. The truth is more uncomfortable. The British and Americans won together, while often disagreeing deeply about how victory should be won. They needed each other. They irritated each other. They admired each other's strengths and resented each other's habits. They fought Germany while also fighting the internal pressure of alliance itself. And Britain's role was not passive. Britain did not simply wait for America to arrive and solve the war. Britain had endured, adapted, planned, supplied, fought, and bled, long before the final campaign in Europe. British commanders were not always right. British politics could be proud. Montgomery could be infuriating. But British caution came from a country that had already learned the cost of being unprepared for catastrophe. America brought scale, momentum, and power.
Britain brought experience.
Position, endurance, and a memory of disaster that shaped every major decision. Together, those qualities defeated Nazi Germany in the West. Separately, they often clashed. That is why the alliance was so difficult, and why its victory mattered, because it was not won by men who always liked each other. It was won by men who, despite suspicion, ego, argument, and national pride, still managed to keep the guns pointed in the same direction. The posters showed unity. The command rooms showed something harder. And in that harder truth, the Allied victory becomes not less impressive, but more.